today I have with me Joel Pearson. Joel Pearson is someone I've just come to know, and I'm excited to get to know him here. And we're going to do a little back and forth and hear a little bit of his story. So if anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Tim. I'm in just above Atlanta, Georgia, here in the United States. And Joel, could you give us a little description of who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm Joel Pearson. I'm from England. I'm pretty much an amateur in atheist circles and historical circles and so on. My actual profession is in IT, but I'm definitely fascinated with the history of Christianity, and I've read a lot on psychology and philosophy, cosmology, just all the areas which touch on religion in general. So yeah, just as an amateur, definitely caveat that so that I'm not an expert in anything. But it's an area that I'm really interested in developing, and I have a sort of hunger for knowledge and meeting interesting people and talking to them. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I've seen a couple of your videos, and I've really appreciated just the insights that you bring to the table. I feel like I'm like a sponge, just soaking up a lot right now, and someday hoping to give back and help add to the conversation. But just it's been really good to hear what you've had to say, and especially with Derek and Myth Vision and so forth.
Right, yeah. So you saw the Myth Vision interviews?
I did. I've watched it a couple of times actually. Yeah, I feel like some of these interviews and speeches, there's so much in them that I have to go back a couple of times just to make sure I got it all. I'm an avid note taker, and often I'll just go back and make sure I've really got everything, because usually what I come away with is a whole list of things that I didn't know before you did your interview. I'm like, all right, obviously these guys know a lot more than I do. And when you start spouting stuff off, I'm like, I need to know what that means. And so I appreciate all those little tidbits you guys add to it.
It's the same when I'm reading a book. There'll be a footnote somewhere, and that just takes you down a whole rabbit hole where you've got like a list of books to read after that.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's the same with even just Google searches. Like I've been recently doing some stuff with this Pythagoras, 153 and all that stuff. And I'm like, before long, I've got like 20 tabs open. I'm like, whoa, there's a lot of stuff here. I got to slow down and just focus on one micro subject at a time before I try to tackle 20 of them at a time.
Do you know the story of how Pythagoras died?
No.
So you know one of his things in his religion, he was super against beans, like really hated beans, didn't want to touch them. He was being chased by assassins and ended up at a field of beans and refused to go through them, so he was killed.
That's right. I do remember actually.
It's one of the stories.
Yep. Yeah, I remember that. I do remember now that you mentioned it. That was really funny that you just wouldn't walk into that field because he was so afraid he was going to be trampling on them.
Yeah, it's probably not true, but it's one of the things that his followers wrote, because I don't think we have anything from Pythagoras. We've only got followers of his writing their own accounts of him.
Yeah. I had no idea how much he influenced the Bible. I mean, and I just was reading, I think it was just in this past week, that the Essenes were known as the Pythagorean Jewish mystics or something like that, the Pythagorean sect of Jewish mysticism, and it kind of began to make some sense as to that, just how much of his stuff kind of trickled out. And I know a lot of it was just pure math and geometry and helping the world in senses that we all benefit from. But a lot of that mystical stuff, it stuck. And especially with their, I'm not able to speak to this subject, but I'm just touching on gematria. And
yeah, that's really interesting.
It's blowing my mind, and I'm not sure I won't be ready to talk about that one for a while. I just need to kind of let it
Well, if you want to see how gematria works in its original context, there's a fictional historical book by was it Edwin Herbert.
Okay.
I've got to try and look this one up. Mythos Christos, it's called.
Yeah.
It's a fiction book, but it actually tries to flesh out what it was like in ancient Greek culture, and it focuses on a modern-day archaeologist, and then trying to discover clues left by Hypatia of Alexandria. So it's kind of like a national treasure, treasure hunt style a story where you've got the Catholic Church trying to destroy the evidence, and this guy trying to discover the evidence at the same time, and having a little race, and then sort of having flashbacks to history, key points and key people.
I've heard of the book. I have not honestly read it or even read much about it, but I'll definitely
It's
put it
very
on my
good.
list. Yeah, I'd like to be much more educated, and it's stuff like that that just I wanted to, and I'll tell you more about my story in a little bit. I want to get back to your story, but just to add this, I went to Bible college, endless education, and there's so much that they just don't tell you, and you're like, even if their point in saying it was to give a rebuttal, say, let me tell you about an interesting tidbit of history, but this is how we as Christians interpret it. Fine, but at least put it out there. I discover stuff every week. Sometimes it feels like every day. I think, 40 years of being exposed to solid evangelical, conservative Christian preachers, teachers, almost all of it, not a word. I mean, I remember, just like an hour or two of textual criticism in Bible college. I mean, they barely mentioned it. I think the whole Gilgamesh epic was talked about for all of 30 seconds. It was like,
Yeah. The Untitled reference.
totally not even relevant to them. And yet, once you realize what's happening, you're like, this changes everything. Anyway, I'll tell you more about my story. I do want to get back to some questions for you. So you're in England. Are you married? Have any children?
Yeah, married, got 2 kids.
Okay, awesome. Are they still little?
I've got a 12-year-old and a 2-year-old, so
Oh wow,
it's quite a range.
that is. We are what I would call a romper room. We have 4 kids under age 6.
Yeah, that's
Right.
chaos.
It is chaos. But they are awesome, and the older ones are starting to get enough maturity to help a little bit. So I think it'll be pretty exciting over the next
Yeah,
few
they
years.
get to entertain each other as well, which is good.
It is, yeah. When they're not trying to kill each other.
That is entertainment.
Yeah, entertainment as well. So, could you tell me a little bit more about just your story? Not as much what you're doing now, but where did you come from? If you want to start in early childhood, that's fine, or if where you want to start. But in terms of the getting to eventually the big shifts that occurred in your thinking, and I honestly don't know all of them, so I'm not assuming that they're what I think are, but I would love to just hear you describe those big shifts at the end. But compared to where those shifts took you, where did it start, and what was that like?
Yeah, I can give you sort of the condensed version. I did actually do an interview on the deconversion stories with Neil Bernstein. Neil's the 604 Atheist.
Okay.
Which I'll have to send you the link to that.
Thank you.
But basically, my parents were missionaries. So when I was 3, we moved from England to France to learn French. Then when I was 4, we moved to Chad in the middle of the Sahara Desert.
Wow.
So I stayed there, and it was sort of every 3 or 4 years we'd come back for a year or 6 months or so.
So would you say you grew up in Chad? Was that?
Yeah, definitely. Stayed there until I was 12, on and off. Let's see. Came back to England. Then I went to Cameroon when I was 14 until age 16 to do boarding school. While I was there, my parents moved to Kenya, so I had to go back from Cameroon to Kenya instead of to Chad. Okay. We'd been in like Ivory Coast for a while as well, just because there was a good hospital there when my dad got sick. We went to visit Nigeria a few times, but yeah, it was mostly Chad, and then Cameroon was where I spent my time there as a missionary kid. And while I was there, I went to American international schools alongside French schools, Chadian schools. But it was the American school I went to between 14 and 16, where they taught me young earth creationism, climate change denial, biblical literalism. We had to memorize Bible verses.
Okay.
So instead of doing like the normal curriculum stuff, I was doing very Americanized Christian stuff. And
were your parents actually doing any evangelism, preaching, anything directly with the Bible?
Yeah, they worked with Wycliffe Bible translators.
Okay.
So it was their goal to translate the Bible and the Jesus film into pretty much every language. So Africa's got 2,000 languages. Mm-hmm. So it's not an easy job. And usually what they'll have to do is they'll have to teach literacy. So they'll have to encourage the government to teach not in the colonization languages. So for example, in Chad, you've got French. And in Cameroon, you had German originally, as it was a German colony, and then it was split in two. So you ended up with English in one half and French in the other half. So it really messed with the country's growth. So they would only teach in the national languages, and then maybe major trade languages like Arabic. But then you'd have something like 200 languages just in Chad. So they had to sometimes create a written form because some languages are only oral. They would have to encourage literacy as well. And my mother would teach translators how to translate, like as a consultant. So not just translate yourself, but teach other people how to continue the work and improve on it. And then, of course, you have the issue with idioms where you've got to translate from, do you go from like the Hebrew, which has got one whole set of idioms, into English, which has got another set of idioms, and then into the other language, or do you try and shortcut straight from one to the other?
Yeah.
They've all got their own problems. I'm
very familiar with some of those issues, and I'll tell you more about my story in a little bit, but that's really interesting. Do you consider England more, does England feel more like your home, or does Africa feel like more like your home, or is it split?
I'm kind of at home in England, mostly just because of the comforts.
Yeah, gotcha.
Do you ever get to go back things like electricity?
Do you ever go visit ever? Or?
No, I haven't been back, not since the school years.
Okay, gotcha. That's awesome. And so just I like to repeat stuff back to people just to make sure I kind of understand it all and summarize it. So you grew up at a pretty early age on the mission field, and part of that was an education that included some what we consider very conservative Christianity that I would label at this point as indoctrination. Did you feel like when you were being exposed to that you had any issues at that time, or did it feel like, well, this is just what being a Christian is? It's getting the truth, and this is the truth. This is just what we need to do to love Jesus and to honor the truth of his word and how the biblical worldview fleshes out? Or was there any early signs of like, oh, I'm not sure? Like some people I've talked to, they're like, no, I had issues early on. It just took me a long time to really identify it. I'm one of those people. But like, what were you like as a kid when you were being taught this stuff?
Well, I was always taught that faith was a virtue. So if I did have any doubts, I was taught to crush them, basically. Just press those doubts, and it meant you had more faith. So that was pretty much what I did. So yeah, and doubts that I did have, I pretty much just stomped out, which was a shame because I'm enjoying now things like science and taking interest in science. But when you're taught that dinosaurs were planted there by Satan to confuse people, it's not a great way to get into the sciences. We weren't taught biology really at all when I was in the American school system, because biology, of course, hinges on evolution, and they couldn't teach that. So yeah, we had those little chick tracts thing. Yep. The bombardier beetle couldn't have existed, and the eye couldn't have evolved, and all that stuff. So yeah, it was very very young Earth creationist, didn't really think much about any contradictions. I think that religion has crept into language in quite a nasty way. Things like people saying gospel truth as if those two words have any connection. And even the King James Bible's all over the place in English.
Yep. That's funny. Yeah,
it wasn't...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
You can add on to that. I was going to move on to the next part of the story, but
I was just going to say, just as a side note, I've been cataloging as a little side list from all the things I'm thinking through, some of the ironies, and that's, I'll put them on the list. There's a lot of ironies of things such as the truth will set you free in a book that is, well, a prison. It's just funny.
Yeah.
So, and there's so many.
I guess from the perspective of the author, if you look at what each author was thinking, they generally did believe that what they were writing was true.
Right.
And even you can skirt around that by saying, well, maybe not literally true, but metaphorically true. Like Mark, for example. Yeah. Mark was very into layering things and using parables where you tell a story that's not true, but it's supposed to convey a truth.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say I'm on the edge of understanding some of those layers. I've been digging in, but I like to really make sure I've kind of mastered a subject and understood it enough to pretty thoroughly explain it or write a little essay about it before I kind of dive in. So I'm kind of on the periphery of that. I've been looking at the Markin sandwiches and so forth, but I do have a lot that I need to learn to really feel like I get that. But I know what you mean.
So have you read The Power of Parable, which I think was John Dominic Crossan?
I have not. It's on the list. I've heard that. I've listened to Dr. Carrier a lot, and he mentions that one at least once in one of his videos. So it's definitely at the top of the list.
That's the problem. There's not enough time to read everything.
There is.
I'm still working my way through.
I mean, I've got On the History of Jesus right here, that's a huge book.
That's a tome. I
whole bunch of others.
Getting it in Audible, because then you get the pronunciations of all the words and all that as well, which helps.
Does he do that?
Yep, he reads it himself.
Okay.
Every Audible book that Carrier's put out, he's read himself.
Awesome. I'll do that. Good. Thanks for sharing that. So you were on the mission field, going to this conservative school, and what happens next?
So when I hit, what is it? Is it AP levels? In England, it would be A levels. In America, I forget exactly how it works. But my parents decided that they wanted me to go to an English school to do with higher education.
Okay.
So they decided that was the time to move the operation back and just work from England, sort of managing the teams out in the field rather than being a team out in the field. And that was when I spent 2 years in school and then got a job after that. But it was a huge culture shock going from living in basically a cult community, in the sense that we were native English speakers and we were white in a country where not many people were. So like the kids would shout "Nasara, Nasara" when they saw you and chase you around thinking you had money. Which, being missionaries, we were poor, but I guess we were richer than the people around us, even so. So yeah, it was a huge culture shock to go from a society where basically everyone was Christian and no one would ever question things, moving back to England, which is actually a majority atheist country now. And especially going to work where there were very few Christians, because working in IT, being a sort of analytical engineering style field, you don't meet many Christians. And I think it took quite a while for that to burrow its way into my subconscious, because I had a few friends, like I had a friend who was openly pagan, one who was Buddhist, one who is atheist but didn't really talk about it very much. But I always enjoyed talking theology and philosophy, so I would just hang around other areas when I wasn't very busy, and we would just chat about stuff like that.
What was that like? I mean, was that intimidating to hear them? Did you want to constantly be like, yeah, but I've got the truth, or were you just more passively absorbing it all?
Oh, I find it really difficult to make enemies. Like I get along with pretty much everyone I meet, so yeah, I would be happily received and have conversations with all sorts of interesting people. I like to collect interesting people as well. Like if there's someone I know who's like a gold mine of information, I'll just keep contact with them. And like just every now and then refer to them and learn something new off of them.
That's awesome.
It's really good to collect connections like that. So I sort of gradually got used to the idea that, how would I say, so that religion was sort of getting less and less important, in the sense of it being a little bit more embarrassing to talk about, because I realized that there are other people who are intelligent as well and they have their own opinions. But I never really doubted Christianity itself. Like I never doubted that God existed. And in this time, I was also like a worship leader, playing in the band at church as well. I would go there really early to practice, do like multiple services, that kind of thing. And I was pretty much there every week.
Did you do any
I think
preaching
those
or
regular
teaching?
sessions. I helped out with the kids and stuff, but I never like went on stage to preach or anything like that.
Okay.
I was happy with music because I'm autistic, so I'm usually quite shy in like really big public situations, unless I've got a honed skill that I can rely on. So, like playing and singing, I can do because that's a trained skill.
With the autism,
giving speeches.
does that still affect you the way it would have in childhood, or is it different from then? Like I'm honestly not too familiar with how it can. I know it can come out in many different ways.
I think so. The psychiatrist who analysed me with Asperger's syndrome said that I handle it pretty well, and I'm quite good at hiding it. It's just I find like large social situations really draining.
Gotcha.
So I sort of run out of batteries and then just go all sullen and quiet and hide.
I don't think I've got anything like that, but I definitely am one of the people that agrees with. I'm an introvert, and so I love being with people. I love being at big parties and interacting with a lot of people. But there's a side of me that finds that draining, where I don't need to come back to myself, but I really find my batteries recharge when I've had a chance to kind of just do something even for myself, just edit some pictures or read something. It's I definitely can't just go with the public, which is kind of interesting because with COVID and working from home now, it kind of gives you that a little bit more than usual, which is it's just interesting how that dynamic works. I wonder if it's this is a side note to our conversation, but I wonder if it's helped people who are like us that kind of need a little bit of downtime, and if it's difficult for people that just constantly want to be in a conversation with somebody. I'm sure there's people that for whom it's very challenging to not be constantly chatty with your neighbor right next to you and so forth. But,
yeah, well, I guess it's easier to avoid social interaction.
yeah, exactly. So you came back to the U.S. I'm sorry, to England, and you are at this point working in an IT world. You're involved in your church in a mostly musical sense, doing ministry that way. Your parents are still missionaries, but from England, doing same kind of ministry work. Okay, and then
I think my dad was a director and representative to UNESCO at the time, sort of encouraging literacy education in other countries. My mum was working as a translation consultant and getting a master's degree in that, in linguistics, so around that sort of time. So there was like a whole load of little things that people said to me that changed my mind. So like my boss at work, when we were in a 2-hour car drive, asked me, other than the people, what do you get out of church? And I really struggled to answer that because I'd already had a lot of little questions and conversations and little hiccups by that point. And I was kind of thinking, you take all the people away, what's left?
Yeah.
Which was a big question, and I didn't realize it at the time, but that's like a street epistemology style question.
Yeah.
It's something where you don't directly attack someone because I would have been on the defensive, but just an honest question from someone who just wanted to know.
Yeah. Can I ask, as you're getting into these stories, one question that comes up a lot with atheists is, well, you were never really a Christian to begin with. And I'm just curious, I haven't dealt with that question myself yet, but I've heard a lot of people say it. Did you have anybody either kind of suggest that what was happening behind the scenes, or did you ever question that yourself? And I guess what I mean, to maybe put it more directly, is did you fully understand the biblical gospel, the gospel of grace and a substitutionary atonement? Was that crystal clear to you? And did you fully believe it in the sense of you knew that you were a sinner deserving punishment, and you knew you needed someone to be in your stead to take your place, that was obviously Christ, the perfect lamb, and that by trusting his death as your sacrificial substitute, you were justified, you were declared righteous in God's sight, and that his righteousness, Christ's righteousness, gets attributed to you, thereby giving you a right relationship with God? I mean, was that crystal clear in your mind, or do you feel like that was real to you?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely a true believer. Like, went through plenty of times where I would have died for Jesus, especially reading the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Mm-hmm. But it's something, I have had that accusation leveled at me, but never by people that actually knew me personally when I was a Christian.
Okay.
Because, I was a pretty diehard Christian at the time. I mean, obviously, you can't attend indoctrination sessions once a week, every week for like 30 years without that rubbing off on you a bit. And I was a huge, an avid reader of Philip Yancey, Max Lucado, things like Adrian Plass, C.S. Lewis. So, I read a lot of theological books, and I was really into it. And it's something we even studied in schools as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I knew the Bible pretty well. I'd read the entire Bible cover to cover twice by that point as well.
Okay. And so as you're starting this part of your life where you're in some conversations with people, you still were not questioning your faith or the legitimacy and validity of the Bible. You were just kind of exploring some philosophical topics with people. Is that there
Yeah,
all was at that
it's more
point?
like there was a few chips on the paint, maybe, but it's
Okay.
like you just rearrange how you think and you fit it into that. And then I remember there was another incident where somebody talked to me in the church, actually. Somebody mentioned while we were having a prayer meeting before the actual service, it was just a worship group, someone said, just offhand, well, we're only like 1% different genetically from monkeys. And my teacher back in the old school, the American school I went to, had told us that we were closer genetically to bananas than to monkeys, because creationists love to lie. So I said that, I regurgitated what I'd been told, and everyone looked at me, and they were too polite to disagree, so I just went, okay, then carried on. But then having said that, it was sort of easing away at me, going, is that actually true? So then I went and checked, Googled it, which I wouldn't have been able to do, of course, growing up, because I had no internet, no way of fact-checking apart from going to the library, which I would just read fiction books anyway. But yeah, so I found that I was wrong, and I went, I don't want to make that mistake again because it's embarrassing. I hate being publicly wrong. I want to learn about evolution so that I don't accidentally do that again. Even though I thought it was false, I was like, at least I'll understand it a little bit better and be able to represent my opponents properly. So I wanted to understand it so I could argue against it. So I looked around and thought, what's the best book on evolution to read? The Selfish Gene kept popping up as like number one on every list. So I read that whole book, and it all made sense. And I was like, oh, I was wrong about that. But all I did was I just adjusted my world to say, okay, so there is a God and evolution is true. It's really easy to find theologians defending that. The majority of Christians believe that anyway. So it kind of rocked my world in the sense that I was drastically wrong about something. But the thing that really hit me was my teachers lied to me. So I said, okay, if the people I trusted growing up, all these authority figures, the teachers in my school especially, if they lied to me about this, what else did they lie to me about? And I was really impressed with Dawkins. Like he writes like a poet. He's got an incredible way of getting lucid points across. So I said, well, I want to read another book by Dawkins. So I found The God Delusion. And I started reading that book while I was still leading worship in church. 2 weeks later, when I finished the book, I walked out. Just left the church and went, because the systematic process of reading that book was every argument I thought I had left to defend a God was stripped away one by one. Like it was all, every piece I had of me that was still believing in a God just got picked apart. And I couldn't argue with it. Like each time I went, actually, it's a really good point. Yes, that's true. You check the facts. It's definitely true. It was all ripped apart. And then I basically was left with like no worldview and no life and no way of thinking my way around it. So, but I was still in a learning mood, and I had some free time because I wasn't preparing for church anymore. I wasn't doing all this band practice. Because I wasn't going to church anymore, I wanted to sort of step out of that world, because one of the things in the book it mentioned was the way you can change people's emotions. You can like influence them, use mass hysteria, use music, and all sorts of emotional manipulation. So I wanted to step back from that, reevaluate my worldview. And that's when I discovered a book by Richard Carrier called Sense and Goodness Without God. There weren't many books like that on the market at the time. Like it was really hard to find one. So I found that, which was my introduction to Carrier. And that was brilliant. Yeah, I picked up so much from that book, managed to rebuild my world. I also read Hitchens' book, God Is Not Great, which was brilliant as well. So it was like Dawkins' book, but it's taking some real world examples and just showing how religion causes harm. So that was useful as well, to sort of not lapse back into religion. So yeah, that was kind of the big turnaround moment. And then I went off on a reading spree. Like I spent years reading as many books on philosophy, psychology, cosmology, like quantum physics. Just like every gap where they like to put a God in, I would read every book on that.
So just backtracking a little bit. So when you were mentioning that, I think you said 2 weeks where you're reading The God Delusion. that's when you would say you walked away from Christianity, you're deconverted?
Yeah, I think it was a pretty quick switch flip. So there's
Yeah.
lots of things leading up to that, sort of
Mhm.
destabilizing, pulling a bit of the supporting out from under it. But that pillar was still there up until that last page of that book, where I went, "Oh, there's nothing left," and then I stepped back because you
Mm.
get so engrossed in the book, like you just want to read the next bit and keep moving through. It was one of those page turners, and it wasn't until I finished the book and closed it that I realized I've got nothing left.
That, I mean, it's such a powerful experience. Mine was a little bit different, but I'm amazed when I hear stories like that of the the power of getting what I would consider the information that you should have had from the beginning, without the bias that should have been gone from the beginning. I mean, you just get the facts, and they're laid out in a way that is really honest with the facts and is fair to you to say, hey, we're not going to shove this down your throat. Just, this is the truth of the matter. You decide what you want to believe. And when people have that freedom and the information that they need, it seems very, very consistent from my experience, that unless, I mean, there's obviously stories where people stay, and there's stories even where people supposedly leave and come back, and I'd question what were the reasons for leaving, and I'd want to know that story, the details. But it's like, it makes me think, what evidence did you have to leave, and what evidence, I mean, what possible evidence could you have that would take you back into it? But that's a topic for another day. But it's so powerful what it does. And I'll tell a little bit more about my story in a little bit. But could I ask? I know a lot of people that I've read about and heard their stories. They mention the dynamic of being sad, even depressed. Christians will often give the question of, what are you living for then? If God's not real, what are you living for? And that is more of their accusation to us, but just our own introspection of like, wow, like what's left? Did it feel depressing to you? Did it feel like weight was lifted from your shoulders in some way? Like, what was that? I know you said it was a pretty short time frame, but in 2 weeks and maybe the month after, say, like, what was that like emotionally and just as you're processing it? Was it chaos? Was it peace? Like, what did it feel like?
I felt kind of dazed during the time, sort of. I mean, even from finishing The Selfish Gene and sort of on from then, after reading The God Delusion, it felt sort of like, walking through a cloud of woolness, and everything was a little bit distant and blurry. Because that's just sort of, you're sort of mentally processing a lot of things, and I'm sure there's a lot going on unconsciously that you're not really consciously processing. But it was discovering logic. I'd never been taught logic before. I'd never learned logic formally, and learning about fallacies. So that was a huge thing. So after taking that out, trying to view the world analytically, that gave me this real sense of wonder and discovery, and sort of rediscovering being 3 years old again, just wanting to know everything about the universe, because like, oh, wow, this is so much bigger than I thought it was. I used to think it was all like in this God's hands, and you're on a rock in space without anyone protecting you. It's like a huge, it's an earth-shattering feeling of awe and a bit of fear, but then there's so much fear that's removed as well, because you're like, well, I don't have to worry about hell anymore. And I used to think that hell was a real threat. So, yeah, I guess you sort of get some fears taken away, others added, but on balance, it's definitely a positive change. And also, I was lucky to discover Julia Sweeney's, what was it, monologue, like a 2-hour monologue, Letting Go of God, which was brilliant. Like her journey through that, it was very different from reading the book, because that was very analytical and factual. And she put emotion into it, and she dealt with that question about, how do you feel about this, and sort of her journey through that. So even if you're partway through that journey yourself, you can see your way to the end. So I thought that was brilliantly done, really helpful.
Yeah, that was. I just watched that. I'd watched it a long time ago and kind of forgot about it, and someone mentioned it a few weeks ago, and I watched it about a month ago, and it was good to go back through it a second time. That was clever. I like how she does that. She's very entertaining, but she's very honest about it. She kind of went through a lot more. Maybe it's in this, maybe it's in that. Maybe I'll find truth here. Then I was like, it's Christianity, or it's not there, and that is probably a little bit of an arrogance of like, it just, when you're a Christian, it feels like this is obviously the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through Jesus. This is it. And it feels like it's the best of the best of the best in every sense. So it kind of feels like if this isn't it, everything else we already know is so much lower. It's so much less rational. It's so much less appealing in the sense of the forgiveness and the grace and the beauty of the gospel. So if this isn't true, then there's nothing else to go to. It isn't like I need to try. But I know I think Dr. Carrier said something about, he did that too, where he went to, I think, Taoism or something briefly, and just tried different paths. Mine was very directly, it was, I was absolutely committed to Christ, and it was, it was real. And when I realized it's not real, it just was like night and day. It was over. Not saying that's the right path for other people, just saying that was my path. I didn't have any interest in saying maybe I should investigate this religion or that philosophy. It was just like, if this isn't it, then to me, from where I'm coming from, God has never spoken. There's no communication in any way, shape, or form from any God. Therefore, if there is a God, technically, yes, I'm an agnostic in that, of course, there could be a God in some other dimension or universe who's just not talking to us. That's technically true, but any God in the sense that we think of, like a God who communicates and loves you and wants a personal relationship with you and deeply is passionate about rescuing you from yourself and bringing you to a glorious place of love with him, that's not real. That's just, it was gone. It was gone immediately. But
I've changed my mind on agnosticism. I used to call myself an agnostic atheist, but reading Aaron Ra's book and sort of seeing his talks have pretty much changed my mind on that now, where I would identify as an epistemist and a Gnostic atheist. Okay. So I would say I know there is no God. Gotcha. Just mostly because of the logical inconsistencies, and if something's logically impossible, then it is impossible. Mm-hmm. And sort of with Stephen Hawking's view on the origin of the universe, and sort of when you go deep into this on the cutting edge of the science, then there's just no room for gods.
Yeah, there's not. It's interesting that you say that, because one of the dynamics that I feel like I think about and feel a lot with this is kind of going back to the question of the subject of people who've left and come back, went back in Christianity for whatever reasons they had. I feel like I've said this to a few people, and I've said it in my mind as I've thought through it. You couldn't give me anything in terms of enough historical documents. Like there's a mental shift that occurs that you think, what was I thinking? It shifts, and you couldn't go back under any circumstance. It isn't like you're saying, and this is where Christians would probably say, what you're saying is, God, I'm angry at you, I'll never go back, or you're just saying, I'm God, I'm on the throne, I'm the captain of my ship, and I'm in charge, so therefore I don't want God back. And it's like, no, I'm not saying I don't want God back. I'm saying there's no God, and there's never been one. There is no God to get back. I'm not God, I'm not in charge. There's no one who's ever been in charge. And once you free yourself from that mentality, it's just mind-boggling when you look back at your own past and you look at people still in it, and you realize how much brainwashing has occurred, how much indoctrination has occurred, and how hard it is for them to escape. I mean, it took me 43 years to escape. And I'll tell you a little bit more either later in this conversation or in another video about some of the early cracks that I probably should have or could have picked up on, but they didn't. Like you said, you just kind of reconfigure it and make it stick with, there is a way to explain it. Faith is the virtue, not doubt, but faith is the virtue. So if something seems like it doesn't fit, you make it fit, knowing perhaps that there's Bible scholars that are much heavier hitters than you that could explain it, and you just need to learn what they know. or if nothing else, someday in heaven, God will explain to you what the answer was to your supposed question or your, supposed discrepancy in the scriptures. God will explain it, and then you're like, oh, there wasn't a discrepancy. Thank you, God, for showing me what the truth was. It all did make sense. I just didn't know it. And it's long story short, it's mind-boggling to me what this religious stuff does to our brains. And before I go into my next part of my questions with you, part of my motivation, and this is where I'm a little bit frustrated at some of the other atheists that I hear interviewed, especially some of the mythicists. And I mentioned this in my last interview with David Fitzgerald, but there are some people that I hear where they're just, you ask them, why do you care? Are you trying to pull people out of Christianity or religion? And their answer is something like, I don't care what people believe. I'm just curious. This is just fascinating stuff. And I'm like, I get it. It is fascinating stuff. It's at least that for sure. I mean, when you start looking at Pythagorean stuff that's in the Bible, the gematria, the mimesis, it's endless. This stuff. It's amazing what they did. The whole Homeric stuff, the Luke, Acts, Iliad, Odyssey stuff. It's mind-boggling how they did it and how they wove all these things together, and in such a way that very few Christians even know it's there. It's like it's hidden, which I guess that's what mystery religions are supposed to be hidden. But when you look at this stuff and you think, I'm just curious about it. It just fascinates me. And I think, wait a second. We're not talking about a topic in history. We're not saying, did they invent the wheel, and this year, was it 100 years earlier that the wheel was invented? Did they have, iron chariots here, or was it a little bit earlier in history? That doesn't really matter. That's interesting. That's curious. But this is different. This is about indoctrination. This is about people living their entire lives with a worldview that is completely mythological, and then teaching kids and indoctrinating them with stuff like God sees every thought in your head, and he really, really, really likes blood, lots of blood, and just all this bizarre stuff, and just the shame culture. You are profoundly broken. You're not dying in your sins. You are dead. You are not in an ocean asking for someone to send you something to grab onto to stay afloat. You are the corpse at the bottom of the ocean. You are completely dead in your sins. And you teach kids this, all of sin have fallen short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one. You put that in kids from the earliest age and instill in them all this stuff. I can't in good conscience say, I'm just curious about mythicism. I'm just curious about the origins of Christianity. I mean, I am. And there's honestly part of this that's just academic, factually. It fascinates me. And I'll tell you more about the math. I'm particularly fascinated by the math. I don't think Christians have any idea how much math is woven into the Bible. And I'm not talking Bible code stuff, just the Pythagorean stuff and the gematria stuff and other stuff that I'm sure you know about. But when you add this all up to teaching kids, and then you also, in a passive sense, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of taking us off the main topic here, but I'll wrap this up quickly. When you add, in a passive sense, very thorough acceptance of racism, which is, God's chosen people. We're the best. We're the ones he loves. Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. You add a very clear acceptance of genocide, which I know that's, I've heard all the arguments of what it was. It was this, it was that. It wasn't so much of a big deal. It wasn't that at all. Whatever people want to say, if you just look at the verses, it says slaughter everybody, but save the young girls. You say to people as kids, look, this is okay. This is what God wants. This is God's version of morality. And even stuff as simple as Noah, hey, God saw some really wicked people, so he's just going to slaughter everybody instead of just the wicked people. All these things that you're not even teaching them directly. They're just kind of passively weaving into the worldview. And then you do what we do and you escape. I'm like, this isn't just academic for me. This is personal, and I am in a as kind of a gentle and as friendly of a sense as I can do it. I want to be a militant atheist. I want people to escape, because this stuff is garbage and it's hurting people's ability to just see basic reality. And it obviously is affecting politics and a lot of other stuff all over the world. I mean, that's a whole other topic. But having said that, can I ask you, what is your take on how you address that? Do you feel like there's a responsibility that we have to help people to get the information so that they can make, sorry, my dog slept, but whatever, so that they can have the information to make this decision? Or do you feel like that's too much? Should it be more, I don't know, passive is the word, but like, how do you, what do you, when you hear what I said, what it goes through your mind?
Well, you touched on a huge number of subjects, but yeah, so there's a lot of psychology in religion, and I think Dr. Darrell Ray's book, The God Virus, is a really good way of looking at it, because then you don't get angry with the people. It's more about understanding that there's a meme underneath it all, and that it's evolved to use every dirty trick in the book to propagate itself, just because that's how evolution really works, is that it will develop an incredible ability to defend itself. And faith is that weakness in the human psyche, which can be exploited by dangerous viruses, even the mimetic viruses. So yeah, it's a good way of sort of backing off and saying religious people aren't the enemy, they're the victims. Yeah. I think Sam Harris said that the greatest victim of Islam is the Muslims. As much as we like to say, Islam is a deadly force against other people, and in particular people who like drumming up ideas about terror attacks and so on, the greatest victims are still those who are in Islam, the ones who can't speak up for their own rights, particularly the women and children. Yeah. But that aside, there's, I think, something to what Hitchens said, which is religion poisons everything. So I do think we have a duty. You could argue it from a self-interest perspective to say, if you live in a world dominated by religion, they will find ways to force themselves onto you. So out of self-interest, you want to live in a world that's more fair and equal, where people can actually communicate with each other, because faith is the end of conversation. It just says, no, I will never change my mind. I will never compromise. I'm right because of my imaginary friend. And you actually, when you mentioned sort of lies that Christians tell about atheists in terms of mischaracterizing why you've left, when they go, you were never a true believer, obviously a lie just used to try and attack people. It's an ad hominem. And when they say things like you just want to sin, and just all these different things they'll use, they try and threaten you as well, so you're going to burn in hell. These are all just desperation tactics used by the religion itself. Yeah. Just sort of infesting people's minds and then causing them to act. So between the whole militant atheism and more calm way of communicating with people, I think they actually have both their uses. So if you have someone who's already curious, someone who's inquisitive and wants to find out the truth, then they will find a way to get there. And that's when things like public debates, books which just lay the facts out without trying to sugarcoat it, there's a place for that. So things like when Richard Carey does a public debate, there's loads of people watching it who are not tied to one side or the other. When they fact check both sides, then they're going to side with him, which is good. But there is a huge place for calm one-on-one discussion with just honest people exchanging ideas. And that would be Peter Boghossian's book, Manual for Creating Atheists, and the Street Epistemology Movement. And I think that that is the most effective way to sort of get a grassroots movement going, which will free people from religion. Because I think people respond best, they let their guard down best, not when they're in a shouting match, not when they're in a big public arena, but when they're just privately having a conversation one-on-one and they want to understand the other person. And I think that's when you can ask those little pebble in the shoe questions, when you can make someone really question, do I care what's true? And once you start asking that question, you go down the road of epistemology and logic, and that will inevitably lead you out of religion, because once you start to look into psychology of religion, the history of religion, and any gap which has been attempted to be filled with a god, all of those roads lead out of religion. So as long as they're not being sort of emotionally coerced back into religion, they will find their way out.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. And it always helps me to remember too, as much as it seems so difficult for some of us who have those conversations to imagine people escaping. It's like you have to remember, but I was one of them once. Like I would have never guessed I'd be on this side of the fence, not in a million years, and yet here I am. And so it's like you have to remind yourself, like, just I would not have wanted someone to attack me or my religion. I would have just wanted the facts. And I think honestly, I mean, who knows, but I think some of these facts probably would have gotten me out earlier had I known. I mean, I just didn't know. But
this is one thing I say when people say, why do you spread around that you're not religious? Why can't you just keep it to yourself? And I go, well, because I wish someone had done that for me earlier, before I wasted 30 years of my life. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing the hypocrisy of their, proselytization and evangelism, and yet you just share your story and you get a lot of pushback. I wanted to ask a little bit about that. That was kind of my next question, actually, so it's a good segue. As you were going through this, you weren't married yet, I assume, at that point in your story?
I've been married since I was 20. So.
Okay, so when you, and I assume your spouse is a believer, or at least was at that time? She
was. She gradually got out as well, thanks to me reading about street epistemology. And so she was super defensive, didn't want to talk about it. She was really confused.
Did you have children yet?
I just ask a question and then leave it for a month, and then ask another question. Just gradually, gently talking about it. So my son was raised sort of part way through in the church. And then 4 years ago we got out, so it would have been 8. So he had a confusing switch when he was 8, from going to church every week to not going.
Mm-hmm. How did you approach the very first, if you remember, how did you approach the very first conversation where you said, honey, we got to sit down and talk, there's been a change, or was it a lot slower than that, or was there a conversation?
I just said I'm resigning from the worship team and I'm not going to church anymore.
Okay.
And she was okay with it, and I offered, if you want to go, so I would take her to church as well. She didn't go as frequently as she did before, but she went to church regularly, took the kids. It took me a while before I started to think deeply enough about it to go, I'm not really comfortable with my kids being raised that way.
So at that point, there was no clear delineation, at least in your communication with your wife, of, I'm not just stopping going to church. I'm mentally out. I'm no longer a Christian. Was that, like, when did that come up?
She kind of knew already. I would listen to audiobooks. So, like, if we were doing a long car drive, because I was always the one driving, I would just put on a book and then listen to it as we drove. So she sort of caught bits and pieces. So yeah, she did know, but she definitely didn't want to talk about it. Get the defenses up.
Yeah.
So it took quite a while for that to settle down.
Sure.
Yeah,
it's awkward. It's an awkward.
And she's not really a reader as well, so she wouldn't be able to articulate and sort of argue it in the same way as me. But we talk a lot more about it now. She's a lot more open and interested, and I think she's like fully left the church now.
Okay.
But she's learning in her own way and developing her own perspective on things. So she's learning at a different route than I did.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk a lot more freely about it now. We're sort of on the same page, which is a relief, because it's quite stressful when you're on different sides of that.
So when you go into your raising your kids for a second, so did you all have a lot of conversations about, looks like we're going to be raising them with two very divergent perspectives, or was it just like laissez-faire? You do your thing, I'll do my thing, and let them, as they get older, make up their own minds, or did you all have did you have to come up with very specific rules, like, hey, we're going to do this, like, how did you handle that? And I guess a follow-up to that is, was that from her perspective, was it offensive to think, we need these kids to be Christians. They need to go to heaven. Obviously, we can't risk them going to hell. If for nothing else, then the whole Pascal's wager stuff. Like, we need to at least have a get a jail-free card, if not a real relationship with God. And from your perspective, was there a sense of, I can't let these kids get stuck in this mythology, or was it not that intense in the divergence?
I kind of went into my own little man cave for a couple of months and just read as many books as I can.
Okay.
The sort of time when I was rebuilding my own philosophy and epistemology and all that. I also got one of Dr. Carrier's online courses on metaphysical naturalism. So that was really good because I could talk to him, and he has such a sharp mind that's like so quick, where every time I thought I'd throw a gotcha at him, he'd already thought it all out and written it. So yeah. I couldn't pull one over on him.
That was really good. Have you ever had a chance to talk to him directly?
So we've talked when I did his course on the forum, and I chat to him occasionally, just like Facebook Messenger, because I support him on Patreon as well. Because I think it is shocking how little support he gets. Because I'm like, this is a PhD scholar, freelance, like doing some of the most advanced research on Christianity and Christian origins. And he gets like less income than someone who videos their cat dancing. It's shocking.
It is, yeah. And I don't mean this in some kind of fan club sense, but I mean, he is a bit legendary. I mean, there's several people that come to mind as the legends of people that have just kind of paved the way and said, hey, there's a whole bunch of information that a whole bunch of you out there don't know, but I'm just going to lay it out for you and save you endless education. Just going to put it right out there with all my sources, and you can get quickly caught up on 20, 30, 40, 50 subjects so quickly, and you know where to go now, you know what to study, and it's categorized in a way that helps you think through it, and it's awesome. He's a bit of a hero to me. So I'm going to put my chair up here. He's a bit of a hero to me, and I love that we've got people like that, and to be honest, I struggled for a long time as a Christian with not having heroes. I know that the concept of find a godly man or a godly couple that you want to be like them because they're like Christ. And I remember for years as a Christian struggling with, I don't have many Christians that I think, I want to be just like you. You're so much like Christ. I would see people for maybe from a distance, and as I got closer to their life, I think, no, you're not really that impressive as a Christian or even as a person. And so I didn't really find that not hero, but just I really, really want to follow in your footsteps. And I feel like I admire some people for what they're doing, and it's hard. I think we take for granted how hard some of their, not you, just we as atheists take for granted some of the difficulties some of these people probably face that never come to light of the pushback that they get, both academically, professionally, and yet they're taking bullets for us because they care about the truth. And I appreciate that. I really do. I feel like I wish I could shake all their hands after COVID's over, of course. Shake all their hands and just say thank you for what you did. You've helped people to escape who, apart from your information and the internet, probably would have never even thought to escape. It just wouldn't have crossed their mind. And I mean, I'm very grateful for what they've done.
Yeah. So referring to like income, say Dr. Carr, for example, it's actually quite good that he's not like massively rich off this in the sense of arguing. So when you say, they'd say, oh, he just writes this to get rich. No, he clearly doesn't.
Yeah.
Like seriously dedicating a lot of time, unpaid time in many cases, to this just shows he has a real passion for a subject, really just wants to learn. Love people who are driven by learning and just they have their own passions and interests.
Yeah.
Re the hero thing, I think, as a Christian, my heroes would have been C.S. Lewis in the early days. And then Adrian Plass later on. I don't know if you're familiar with him. So he's like an Anglican Christian writer, but he's quite liberal. and he satirizes religion like from inside.
Hmm.
So he'll write stuff that's like all warm and cuddly and loving about Christianity, but tells a lot of jokes about it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So he's famous for the Sacred Diary of Adrian Plass, which I believe was a parody of Adrian Mole.
Okay.
But he did like a Christian phrase book where he tells you like what Christian phrases really mean. It's called Bacon Sandwiches and Salvation. So I was a huge fan of his stuff because I thought here's a guy that he doesn't take himself too seriously, which is a really good thing, especially when he started to lean further away from fundamentalist Christianity.
Yeah.
But yeah, now I try not to have heroes and try not to meet my heroes. I guess in particularly the scandals that keep rocking the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a good idea to have heroes. Things like Cardinal Pell, or say Ted Haggard, or just the sheer number of, I guess Jerry Falwell Jr. would be another one recently.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's very true.
A lot of scandals.
So going back a little bit to your story, what was the reaction of your family and friends? How did you deal with talking with them about it? And did you find either, I guess you could imagine, I would imagine different extremes of, trying to pull you back quickly, you got to get saved, be saved or whatever, maybe you weren't saved, but now we got to get you saved, or the shunning, ostracization issue, like how did they approach you, and were you an anomaly, or were there other people in your family that had either gone a similar path or at least were open to it, or were you just like the total different person in terms of belief systems?
My wife's family is very religious, and my family, obviously, being missionaries, my immediate family. My grandmother was an atheist, though, and she wasn't shy about it. So yeah, that was a big loss when she died. But it was really good for me, just like her funeral and the way it was non-religious, and seeing the way religious people cope with a non-religious person passing away. That was it's quite eye-opening as well. But yeah, so I think my parents reacted pretty much like me confessing I was an alcoholic, or that kind of thing. Had like an intervention speech with my dad. But I came out of that and thinking, we're two very different people. We've got very different perspectives. I think the point I realized that I wasn't going to be able to change his mind was when he told me he'd read the God Delusion, because he asked me what changed my mind, and I said I read the God Delusion. And I remember he said the God Delusion didn't change his mind because he started from this perspective that God existed and thought that Dawkins had to disprove it. And he said Dawkins couldn't prove that God didn't exist, therefore God existed. Which made me think, we just talked about logical fallacies and stuff. I was like, how could you not see the fallacy?
Yeah.
So I left that, and we didn't really talk religion at all in my family after that. I met with the pastor of the church a few times, and because between each of our meetings I was reading more and more books, I eventually ended up knowing more about the Bible than him, which I think it shifted the dynamic of our conversations quite a lot. Like, I don't think he knew about the number of forgeries, because I'd finished reading Forged by Bart Ehrman, and then Forgery and Counterforgery, which is the hefty version of that. And that was a real shock, I think, when we had that conversation, because he didn't know about all these forgeries, and because I had it all fresh in my mind, I could just rattle off all the facts and the evidence against it.
Yep.
And yeah, it was a real shock to me to learn that only a quarter of the New Testament was written by a named person that we know who it was. Everything else is anonymous, homonymous, or just a straight forgery.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a real shock to me.
And then when you add on to all that stuff, the clear fighting within the text, where somebody says something, makes an argument, and then later in the same book, I'm thinking of Corinthians here, but in the same book, there's a counter argument, and it's like you can literally see that whether it was Paul that wrote the first one and someone added something, or maybe Paul didn't mention either part, but somebody added this part and then someone else argued this part. Like, even when we have a name, we don't really know what was happening, because there's like this whole void of what were they arguing about for the first, whatever it was, 100 years. Like where is the beginning of it? There's nothing. It's like this big void. And obviously with the documents, we have no idea. I mean, I grew up with, Josh McDowell was, do you know who Josh McDowell is? He was kind of
familiar with him, apologist.
Apologetic hero at that time. I know there's others that have joined his ranks, I'm sure, but he was the apologetic hero at that time. And just this whole, you could read pages and pages of all the manuscripts and how good this was. And I didn't discover until later that even not just unbelievers, but Christians were saying this is not really a very good job. He's not presenting it accurately. And I've been in touch with some Christians recently who, scholars who teach at Bible college, who were like, this isn't, he's not our apologetic hero, so don't go to Josh McDowell. But like, you got this sense of the documents are so good, and then you discover like they're really not good at all. Like we know so little about where these came from and who changed them, who edited them, who redacted them, and the back and forth and the clear interpolations and the clear arguments that are going on. And it's funny, as a Christian, you were just like, your goal is always harmonization. If there's something here, it doesn't make sense with this, it's obviously the mind of God, so how do I harmonize it? And they never present the idea of maybe the reason it's hard to harmonize this is because two different warring factions in the early Christianity or two different Christianities that had copies of these books were fighting each other through the text. And it blows my mind that kind of stuff is just you're totally oblivious to as a Christian. Not even brought up.
That was Bart Ehrman's epiphany, wasn't it? About a mistake in Mark, where he wrote page after page trying to argue against it, and then his professor just wrote, maybe Mark just made a mistake. Went, that is simpler.
Exactly. So was your family? And by the way, my kids I think they were watching a little show or something to give us some quiet, but then you may hear some noises soon. But was your family trying to get you back into Christianity, or did they kind of give you look, you know enough to know the gospel, we don't have to preach to you because you already can preach to yourself? Or were they trying actively? Like, what was that like?
Well, we were sort of tiptoeing around it for a while. Mm-hmm. I think we can be more open now, and we've reached on different sides, but we don't really try and push anything on each other too much. Okay. I had a few private conversations with just individual family members where they disagree with each other, so that was a whole other thing. But yeah, I like to think that we're all closer together now, and we've each made the point to each other. We can see each other's point of view, because that's really the way conversations should go, is that you don't necessarily try and change each other's mind, you're just trying to understand each other's perspective. And just then you can live in harmony with each other, even if you have differing points of view.
Yeah.
Unless the point of view is you'll burn in hell if you don't join me, in which case there's not much you can do about that. Yeah,
which it always amazes me. Yeah. I love you so much that if you don't love me back, I'm going to burn you in hell forever.
Well, I've seen the church change just in my lifetime, where hell used to be preached a lot more. Mm-hmm. And in England, the churches have become a lot softer, and people don't really care so much about religion anymore. They can see through it too easily. Yeah. And you've got, obviously, people like Dawkins from this country have been an increasing influence. Mm. Just since new books published on religion, it's easier to find information than before. And I think the internet could potentially be the death of religion. Yeah. It's so easy to fact check and find information now. Science is so unavoidably effective that religious people are trying to co-opt science now. They used to be anti-science. There's a really good book. I don't know whether every fact in it is accurate, but it's a fascinating overview of history. It's by the co-founder of Cornell University. Okay. I believe it was Andrew Dixon White. And the book was called The History of the Warfare Between Science and Theology in Christendom. It's a really fascinating book. It's full of references just pulled from the library of Cornell University. And yeah, paints this picture over history of all the stuff that I hadn't heard of before, because the church keeps quiet about it.
Yeah.
But just like how the Christians removed the limits on torture that were set by the pagans.
Yeah.
Because the Christians said if someone's possessed of an evil spirit, then you can't just stop torture at the limits of human endurance, which is what the original law was. They removed that restriction, saying, no, you can torture spirits infinitely. So they would just torture these poor people to death for no reason. I mean, the witch hunts, the scale of that is kept down. Like, oh, only a few people were burned as witches. Like, you wouldn't believe that the records don't even exist for the sheer number of people that were hunted down. The pogroms as well, just the amount of Jews that were killed for being Jews. And that was because of the money lending laws, where Christians were not allowed by the Bible to charge interest on money. But they said the Jews were damned anyway, so let's use the Jews to lend money, and they used them as a sort of money distribution system, which is where Hitler got the idea from, that the Jews were hoarding money, because it was a setup by the church. They basically established that rule, and then the rulers were like, well, if we ever want the money back, we just kill the Jews and take it.
Yeah.
Which they would occasionally do. So yeah, it's horrifying when you peel back that bit of history and you find out why Jews are so maligned. And there's even traces of it in Matthew and John. There's some real anti-Semitic stuff early on in the Bible.
Yeah, I listened to some Bart Ehrman stuff a few months ago about that, and I forget which gospel he was focused on. I think it was Mark or Luke, but yeah, it's amazing how much anti-Semitic stuff is in there, and you think it's amazing how as a Christian you don't see it, but once you get out and you start to analyze these books, you're like, wow, that's really like if this is just mythology, we're really making the Jews out to be really bad. And you can see it. I mean, even I was going to say there's a lot of stuff we could go into there, but I don't want to get too far off track. But yeah, it is amazing.
Yeah, we could go down rabbit holes for days.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, as in terms of the whole, family thing, I know that everyone's going to have a different perspective as to how to respond to someone who's left, but I've been shocked when you think these people really, really believe that you're about to burn in hell and that your life is a vapor. You could be gone tonight. You could be gone, whatever, when you're older. But whenever you're gone, unless you bow your knee to your Lord and Savior Jesus, confess Him as Lord, and repent of your sins and accept His atonement through His sacrificial death on your behalf. If that isn't covering you, you are still in your sins. Therefore, you're going to burn in hell. And if you really believe that, to me, there would be some level of, all right, whatever angst I feel about, like, this is now awkward, so I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to offend. I don't want to, or just someone could say, Tim knows the gospel, so what could I possibly say that he doesn't already know, and maybe better even than them? But still, your goal as a Christian is not to assess if someone knows more than you. This even Paul talks about the idea of I didn't come to you with knowledge. It's like a simple gospel. I came that the weak things of this world are the things that are going to undo the wise things that are going to beat them. I'm going to give you the simple gospel. No matter where you think you are intellectually, even if you're the PhD 10 times over, you need to know the gospel. You need it preached to you. And I don't have that coming from anybody, it's really been a shocker to me. And
That's a change, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a non sequitur, or whatever you pronounce that Latin phrase.
Non sequitur.
Non sequitur. It doesn't make sense to me. Like, if it was me and I had a sibling or a family member that I really believe was gonna burn in hell, I would, at the very least, want to keep lines of communication open. For example, I'd want to say, hey, you say you're studying a lot of stuff. What are you learning? I'm just curious. Let's talk about it. Pick a YouTube video that you watched in the last month that's of interest to you. I'll watch it too. Let's talk about it. Not necessarily arguing over it, but let's keep the lines of communication open, because I need, at all cost, I need some way to get the gospel into your head, and that the lack of that is shocking. I have absolutely nobody. I mean, I think I'm remembering correctly. I don't think anyone's done anything. If I'm wrong, it's maybe one person, but I don't think it's even one. I don't remember anybody in the last year since I escaped that has said we really, really need to talk about the gospel. Not one person has tried to pull me back from the flames of hell. Do
you think they still literally believe in it?
Oh yeah, they absolutely believe in it. They believe. I know for sure they believe in a literal hell. I am headed to the flames of hell, and I'm sure.
See, I don't get that, because I know that most of the churches in England are sort of softening down and saying they're going with the annihilation theory, where only believers go to heaven, everyone else gets removed. Or they just call it separation from God or something like that. They sort of dance around the actual wording. They make up stuff the Bible doesn't actually say. But I think that hell is losing its threat just because of the advance of secular morality, because people are now more able to judge right from wrong themselves. They've got more tools available, and they can see in the advancement of laws things like, in the days when there was slavery, maybe, then a person might say, I'm not able to judge right or wrong because God clearly approves of slavery, and who am I to judge? So I must have something wrong with my brain. But now that we're removing all these biblical laws, obviously, like the second commandment is insane, for example. Now that you're seeing that go away, people are more in a position where they can feel for themselves, and in popular media as well. That popular media is really, I know the Christians like to say in a paranoid sort of way it's been taken over by Satanists and atheists, but there is a grain of truth to that, because the creative people are inevitably not the religious people, because religion just tries to crush creativity and destroy imagination. It's one reason I think playing Dungeons and Dragons is an antidote to religion, because you get to develop your imagination and you get to see a world in which gods are real. See what would that be like? A real cleric is able to cast miracles.
Yeah.
So the way I see that is it's killing hell as a threat, because people instinctively know that hell is the greatest evil possible, and they would have to reconcile that with the God doing it.
Did you believe that? Did you believe in a literal hell when you were young at that school you mentioned?
Yeah. When I was with the American school system and all that, but moving back to England, it wasn't really emphasized, and it was sort of dropping away. I mean, hell was mentioned, and a few people did seem to literally believe it, but the position softened over time. I'd seen them sort of pulling back from that. Because if you I don't know if you've done this, you probably have, because you've given it a lot of thought, it seems. If you take hell to its logical extension, then the only solution is to kill babies. Because if you have hell is infinite suffering, therefore infinite evil, and this is the problem with introducing infinity into an equation, it ruins your equation. If you have the other law saying that babies don't go to hell, most people don't believe that babies go to hell if they're too young to understand things, because there's something innately wrong with that. That's their own morality coming through and destroying biblical morality. Then if a baby grows up to an adult and has a non-zero chance of going to infinite suffering, the only moral thing to do is kill them before they reach that non-zero chance. So by Christian logic, you'd have to kill every baby. It's just the logical extension of that equation. Yeah,
make sure they get to heaven.
And Christians really don't like that. But then they're usually not too hot on logical calculations either. They can't see fallacies that are staring them in the face, particularly begging the question. I think every argument for gods begs the question, except for maybe one. And that one is Pascal's wager, which is ad baculum fallacy instead, which is believe it or I'll hurt you. Exactly. I could be wrong. There may be some out there, but I've never found an argument for gods that doesn't beg the question by assuming there's a god and then shoving it into the picture. And
isn't it fair to say with Pascal's wager that if that were logical enough to kind of live by it, that there are other religions with much worse versions of hell. I think Buddhism is a much worse hell, if I'm correct. But aren't there other religions that have much worse versions of hell?
That's
Therefore,
a pretty creative hells. I guess it depends. The Hindu hells are quite creative. I was reading about one the other day in which there's just a lake of semen, and you have to live in that and drink the semen. Yeah, they have a whole list of hilarious hells. And if you've ever read The Apocalypse of Peter, I know Bart Ehrman likes to talk about it. But yeah, that's got lots of creative descriptions in it. The thing is, it's really easy to think up creative hells because we live in bodies that feel pain. So it's so easy to come up with stuff like that. People aren't very good at imagining heavens.
Yeah, it's. Yeah. Although I will say, on that note, not to get into this subject deeply, but I've been starting to look at the Revelation, the book Revelation, where the description of the New Jerusalem with the numbers and the 144,000 and the way the Pythagoras.
That's why you're getting into gematria so much, yeah.
Yeah, and I literally I'm at like level, if there's like 100 levels of knowledge that I need to get, I'm at level like 1.5. So I'm more dangerous than helpful in that subject. But I love realizing that stuff is woven in, not because I want to say, aha, see, your book is more Pythagoras than God. But just like, I'm really fascinated by the question of where did this come from? And I kind of wanted to, I know we've been going for a while, so I'll maybe wrap this up as my last big question. We can talk about it as long as we need to. But if you were to take, I don't know, you don't have to restrict yourself to this, but say you decided to take like 1 to 2 paragraphs worth of a description, and someone were to say, just of all the things you know about where this thing came from, primarily the Christian story, not going back to Yahweh and El and all that, not going back to Samaria and however far back you could take it, but more the 100 BC to 100 AD, 280. Like, if you were to summarize, where did this thing come from? Whether you're going to, bring in, Alexandria, Egypt, you're going to bring in, mysticism. I don't know if you follow with Carrier about the whole archons and the Metatron, the angelology and the cosmology. Like,
I'm looking forward to his new book. Yeah,
I can't wait either. But if you were to put it in 1 or 2 paragraphs, and take a minute if you want to think about how you phrase it, but where did this thing come from? In terms of shifting from the pure Judaistic background, what happened that brought this from that whole backstory to we've got a Jesus that some people think was historical. What started this? Who's doing it? And I know I'm not saying definitive, but if you had to make your best guess or your best statement, who is behind this? When you factor in all the different groups, and you're thinking about, all right, we got the Essenes, the this, the that, the Pythagoreans. There's a lot of stuff that's woven together in a way that's at times almost genius. Who would do that, and who are they trying to give it to? Because there's only so many people that would understand what's actually happening. Who's doing it? Who are they speaking to? And if you have an answer, and if we could also table this for make this the next topic, but when you look at that answer, do you think that they wanted people to know what they were really doing? Or do you think that there is a chance that they truly wanted this to be very hidden, in line with the mystery religion concept, that they didn't want most people? They wanted most people to think, yeah, we're actually talking about a real man feeding 5,000 real people with real fish and loaves. Or do you think that they wanted people to kind of understand what was behind it? I mean, I know that's a big topic, and
that is a big question, and it'd probably take a lifetime to answer, but I'll take a stab at it.
Yeah.
So, caveat in that I am an amateur, and I've only got my own perspective on this, and I'm sure I'll miss a few things, but you have to look at the general context in that first century Judaism was fragmented. They've been stamped on repeatedly by the Romans and others. They were sort of desperate. You've got issues with access to the temple, the corruption of the Sadducees, the sort of for-profit industry that the temple was. And yeah, just the sheer diversity, the amount of external influence, like Zoroastrian influence from the Babylonian invasion. You've got influence from Romulus, from the Roman invasion. And then you've got all these other mystery cults running around, like there's heavy Egyptian influence as well, where you've got things like the Osiris cult. And this is all in the wake of the Sumerian and Akkadian gods with the background, which they influenced the Hebrews, so the original Canaanites. So you got all of this in the big melting pot. So you have all the elements there, and then you've got Daniel. That was written about 164 BC during a revolt, as if it was written centuries earlier. And that has a timeline in it predicting the Messiah. So you've got that timeline was being calculated and recalculated every time it failed. And someone settled on the 1st century, sort of early 1st century. So you got the early 1st century, Messiahs popping up all over the place, loads of people claiming to be the Messiah getting crushed. And so this is where I sort of go into my own perspective on this from those basic facts. And I think either Peter or his predecessor or one of his close companions was already a charismatic cult leader. I say cult in the sense of just one of the sects of Judaism. Judaism was heavily splintered already, very factionalized. As long as you could get away without being stoned, then you could have sort of your own little take on it, because it was constantly with Pesharim, Midrash, and people reinterpreting old prophecies that weren't prophecies, failed prophecies, rebuilding that. And you get this guy who comes up with an idea of what if the Messiah, rather than being killed like all these other Messiahs, was a Messiah that couldn't be killed by the Romans, because he's the suffering Messiah from Isaiah. He's the guy who is killed symbolically in this blood sacrifice ritual that was already a staple of Judaism. You know, blood sacrifice was well established. And then you take in the influence from all these mystery cults and go, well, they've got dying and rising savior gods as well. That goes way back to cycle of the seasons. So you've got all these little mixing pot ideas. And personally, I think he genuinely believed it. I think that the guy who thought up this thought he'd discovered something in scripture. And it's something that people do even today. They'll read the Bible, they'll find an epiphany in there, they go, oh, this must be true. And really all they're doing is they're leaping to conclusions, they're weaving conspiracy theories, and heavily into the gematria side of it as well. You could find all sorts of meanings in there with numbers and rewriting names and coming up with stuff. So you've got this creation.
Do you think they were they looking at it from an angelology perspective, or do you think they thought he was, God, true light of true light? Or was he, was this the Metatron doing this in space?
Well, the tradition in the other cults would be to have a demigod. So they were very sort of anti-sex in Judaism in a way that other cults weren't. But you have to have a Messiah made out of flesh. So the way they could do that would be to take some great patriarch and have him reborn in flesh. To take his sperm and use it to create someone. They knew roughly how that sort of thing works, but there was a lot of confusion about it. So yeah, you could take angelic figures, but don't forget this is like taking all these little pieces and reassembling something new. So it doesn't have to make logical sense either. Like it could just be, we'll fill that gap in with magic and worry about it later. This is what the scriptures say. So I get complaints sometimes saying this doesn't make logical sense. Of course it doesn't. It's a religion.
And I guess too, from our perspective, 2,000 years later, we're trying to look at, and then even just the way I phrased my question, we're trying to look at, like, where did this come from? And it's like, it's as if there's one answer, but there's not. There was multiple answers. This group was saying it this way. This group was saying it this way.
Yeah.
The Gentiles are free to come in without the law. No, the law is important. All these groups fighting each other and trying to, and some of them trying to merge, but try to, sort of undermine each other while merging. And it's not logical, especially when they're trying to merge these divergent beliefs, and especially when you start getting more institutionalized, where you're looking at Marcion and you're looking at the other people that are fighting back against him, and it's like, it goes from these little sects to kind of a semi-institutionalized group where it's like we're an established church and we've got our Bible. Oh no, you don't. We're making the real Bible over here. And it's like it's hard to say, well, which path was the original one. It's like there was no. You can't just say this was the real path, and there was no proto-orthodoxy, or what I guess is Ehrman's word, Bart Ehrman's word, but it's like you can't just say this is where it weaves through. It's like no, it's like a spider web. It's everything moving around, and eventually you do eventually get a couple major tracks, of which one does eventually beat the others to a pulp and becomes orthodox. But
yeah, there's so much context to bring into it. The literacy rate would be rock bottom. You've got Christianity in particular came out of the Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures, the Septuagint and the associated body of work, also known as the Septuagint, because it technically was just the Pentateuch, but there was loads of other translations going on as well. And we can see that because in the scriptures we have now, which were written in Greek, which is a huge clue anyway, you've got mistranslations that happened in the Greek versions as well. So there's you can trace it all back. So you've got these people who are educated in the Greek literature of the Greek gods and Homer and Euripides and so on, heavily influenced by Greek ideas, and they come up with this Greek-style savior, but with all the trappings of Judaism, because the Holy Scriptures are, of course, not Greek, they're Jewish. Mm-hmm. And you get this tangent going off from Judaism, which has just got all the hallmarks of Egyptian and Greek and this melting pot of ideas all in one place. And I'm sure there are many other sects that did similar things that just died out and we never heard of them. This one just happened to get successful. So you basically got Peter, potentially, might as well call him Peter, guy starts the cult. He's got a Messiah that can't be killed because he's already been killed, so well, hey. Basically makes him immune to Rome. You have the sacrifice element, which removes the temple cult completely, which explains why it took off after the actual destruction of the temple, because this started out as a protest against the corruption of the temple, going, well, my God wouldn't let me, wouldn't remove that possibility of salvation from me, so I must have an alternative method, so let's go find it in the scriptures. So you come up with this Messiah savior and go, oh, the Messiah was here already. And then with this motivated reasoning, you have a culture in which visions are seen as signs of the truth. There's this huge respect for people who tend to have epileptic fits, for example, temporal lobe epilepsy, that kind of thing. People who have a predisposition to see things actually get promoted up through society and given positions in the priesthood, and then educated in reading and writing. And it's just the absolute perfect way to get a visionary being popping up as a new cult. So it's just all the different ingredients were there, all at the right temperature, all at the right time, and a heavy pressure to find some new alternative, both of the threat of Rome and with the threat of the temple cult, corrupt temple cult. All these little pieces there. Messiah's dying all over the place. It's the perfect time to just take all those ingredients and build your new religion out of it.
Yeah, it is. It blows my mind. I hate what it has done to people. Obviously we talked about that a lot, but I'm still fascinated by the origin of it. It's mind-boggling in so many ways, and I think it's really cool if you can look at it back from this perspective. I mean, Derek talks about it more of the sense of if you were abused, which I would agree. The church is very, very abusive, not just to individuals, just the worldview is abusive to people in so many ways. But once you get out, you kind of want to be like, I am out, and I'm never going to go back, obviously. But I'm curious as to how did this happen? How did I get stuck in this? And I mean, Matt Dillahunty asked it something like, how did I believe this stuff for so long? And it does. It makes you wonder what's psychologically what.
So if you want to see, if you want to read about sort of the takeoff after that and the spread through the rest of society, there's two really good books. There's The Myth of Persecution by Candida Moss. Mm-hmm. She's a biblical studies professor. Really interesting. And that kind of shows you what the surrounding environment was like. What were the Christians facing? What were they really up against? Because there's loads of false claims about massive persecution, like, Neronian persecution and so on, which didn't really happen. And all this idea about the pagans just trying to stamp out the nasty Christians. But no, the Christians were mostly persecuted for right to free assembly, which was not a thing at the time. You know, if you were assembling and you didn't have a legitimate reason, which as a cult wouldn't necessarily do, then they would be breaking the law. So that wasn't persecution of Christians, it was just persecution of cults meeting. And the other was as atheists, because atheists, you know, atheism has carried the death penalty for a very long time. Christians didn't really appreciate the things that their fellow atheists had gone through, despite being persecuted as atheists. When they actually finally got power, they went and made it illegal not to be Christian on pain of death under Theodosius II, was it? I forget who, but yeah, that might have been Constantius II. But there was a law passed where it was illegal to not be Christian. So that was kind of shows you what happens when they get into power.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the context on that, Candy Demos's book is brilliant in dispelling that myth where they were fighting against the constant attempts by the Romans to kill them. It was a lot more relaxed than that. The pagans just thought they were a bit weird because they wouldn't acknowledge all the pagan gods. Because if you were a pagan, you could worship as many gods as you liked. Go for it. As long as you acknowledged the important ones, the patrons of the empire, then yeah, go nuts.
Yeah. Wasn't there at some point I may be misremembering this, but weren't the Christians, at least at some point, considered atheists because they didn't believe in a polytheistic worldview?
Well, because they would deny all other gods, yeah. So effectively that makes them an atheist against every god except their own.
Yeah.
So that's I believe there's an early Christian writing which actually mentions specifically that they were accused of atheism.
Yeah.
It's in Candida's book. And the other one I would recommend is, another book I would recommend is Not the Impossible Faith by Richard Carrier.
Yep.
But the other one I was thinking of was Bart Ehrman's book, The Triumph of Christianity. And that's a really good one showing how I think roughly a 4% growth rate gets you from the start of Christianity up to the point where they took over the empire. I think they'd reached something like 7% of the Roman Empire's population by that point. Or it might have been the population of Rome. It's been a while since I read it. But it's a natural organic growth rate. That's what happens with exponential growth as you start increasing by percentages. And he explains how the proselytation was done, how there's nothing magical about it. It was just quite an appealing perspective in the time. Because context-wise, again, Rome had been rocked by civil war after civil war after civil war, and there was just no stability. There was no thing like a government pension, social security, anything like that. And the other major religions at the time didn't really didn't pander to like families, to women. They were more like military men, like the Mithras cult. So here comes Christianity, and they say, we're a big family, we have everything in common, as Acts said. And suddenly you've got a social safety net, which the government can't provide for you. And it's actually pretty appealing.
Yeah.
And the way it would usually work is if the man got converted, his whole household automatically converted, because this was back at a time where women were basically property and children as well. So yeah, you could gradually work your way through a society like that. So there were good things about Christianity compared to the surrounding environment. And the way they were so exclusive just meant that, logically, if you treat this evolutionarily, they're going to eventually dominate. Any monotheistic exclusive cult at the time, as long as it achieved better than 0% growth rate, was going to eventually dominate.
Yeah, and eventually you get the official sanction from Constantine and all that.
Yeah, it just snowballed after that.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating stuff. I feel
it's a fascinating study. I definitely recommend reading those books.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I was writing those down as you were giving them. I feel like I could ask you a million more questions. I would love to...
We should do this again.
Yeah, I'd love to do it again sometime. It's really fascinating. I know I guess you're 5 hours ahead, so it's getting late there, but thank you so much.
If afternoons work for you, then evenings work best for me. So yeah. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your insights as well. We didn't get to talk about you as much as I'd like to. Like I didn't ask about your family and like what your situation is in there. Yeah,
I'd love to share some of my journey. It's definitely a passion of mine to get it out there. I feel like with David Fitzgerald's his advice and encouragement, I feel like I'm getting more to a point where I'm learning. Like I started with like this track of, I've got my project to kind of talk about the stuff you were just talking about. How did this happen? Bring it all into the equation and let let people have all the information, but also to, as I'm working on that, to tell my story, and I'm working on the best way to do that. Even that, I feel like I want to do it, not professionally, but I want to do it well. I want to feel like it's not just I'm rambling for an hour. I want to actually have, all the different high points, and get through them all, especially in a way that helps Christians do what I feel like is the issue and here is that it's an information issue. It's not an issue of argumentation. I know a lot of apologists. It's all I want to give you the cosmological argument of this. It's not about that to me. It's about basic information, and I feel like a lot of Christians they just don't know. And one of the things I'm working on. I'll wrap this up shortly, but in my introduction to my video, where I just kind of start my story, where I don't go through all the stuff you just talked about with all the different aspects of where this came from. I just talk about the like a summary of each one. Like, this is what I'm going to get into. I'm going to get into Josephus. I'm going to get into mimesis. I'm going to get into the Greek literature and how it wove. How there's so much literal Greek copying. Even you can just read. You can see Plato right in the scripture, not just structurally, but his actual words right in scripture.
Yeah, and the influence on Philo as well.
Yeah, Philo, and it's all these topics. But I'm going to start it with a short introduction that I think is basically going to say something like, if you asked me, where did this start? How did the ball get rolling for you? It's going to basically be a version of, I'll figure out the best words to use, but a version of saying, I found out something that I never knew before, no one even remotely talked about, and it began to change everything. And then someone else added something else. I was like, I never knew that before, and that changes this. And it just, you say that enough to yourself, like, I never knew that before, and this changes things. You say that 1,000 times, and all of a sudden you're in a different universe. And that's it, over and over in my life. That was what happened in the year or two up to my deconversion. I mean, I didn't realize I was deconverted really till the very end. I kind of think you kind of get deconverted and then you kind of admit it. Maybe that's what's happening.
Yeah, there is a moment of realization where you step back and reassess. Yeah. Although I would say dropping facts on people doesn't work unless they know basically how to fact check and they have the motivation to. Like, I always say, if you don't care about the truth, you're not getting out of religion. Like, you have to start caring whether things are true. Yeah.
And a lot of people won't even, I think, go that far. They won't even be like, I don't care about your facts. I think just my anticipation of some of the feedback is just, they won't even listen. They'll just say, I see your video that you posted, your story, video 1 of whatever, 20 of your story. I'm not going to listen. I'm not going to click play. And so it isn't even like a...
Yeah, but that's fine. Any author's going to have people who don't read their book. But as long as you can reach enough people who are interested, then that's your mission accomplished. There were a couple of things that I felt like I should have added earlier.
Yeah.
So one is, I disagree with David Fitzgerald on Christianity or mythicism being kryptonite for Christianity. Mm-hmm. I'm more inclined to take Richard Carrier's view, which is, if they realized that mythicism was true, they could just go back to the original Christianity. Like, it wouldn't stop them. They'd be like, oh, look, we've discovered the original Jesus, who was a celestial being all along. That's still God.
Yeah. And isn't one of the religions or versions of Christianity today very angelic anyway? I forget if it's...
Probably Gnosticism.
Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses. Somebody believes he's more of an archangel than...
There were so many different sects early on.
I mean, today, isn't there one that says he's just an archangel? Anyway, I need to brush up on that.
I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't know that much about Jehovah's Witnesses, but David Fitzgerald wrote a great book on the Mormons. That's quite fascinating.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And the other thing I was going to say is, so from where I stand, the reason I don't do like atheist activism myself, I just work a regular job. In England, there's not that much call for it, really. Like, religion is dying organically by itself. And I understand in some countries where atheism is still an outlier and is still misunderstood, there's a big call for it. But I wouldn't like dedicate my whole life to it. Like, have yourself a skill, have yourself something outside of religion, something that you can be good at for its own sake and contributes to, advancement, while at the same time leaving religion behind.
Yeah.
It's just my personal take on it, and I'm not saying it's right, but from my perspective, atheism is a non-thing. It's like being someone who doesn't play golf. It's nothing really that much in itself.
Yeah.
So the study of religion, fair enough. Study of psychology, fantastic. Study of logic, great. All of these things are positive things. That's development, it's learning. But just attacking religion is not itself a constructive thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. And the goal is as we're finding ways to have conversations, is just to meet people where they are, and that acknowledge that some people won't listen, or some people, the facts aren't going to help them. They're committed already to their worldview. But I think from where I was coming from, and I could be wrong, I think where I was coming from, there is a sense in which if someone had come along to me, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago and laid this stuff out, I think I would have said, I'd like to hear more. I don't agree with it, obviously, but I'd like to hear how are you concluding that? And you never know. You can never say, as you mentioned C.S. Lewis, C.S. Lewis would have said, no one ever knows what might have been or could have been, however he phrased it, but you don't know. You don't know what would have happened. But I think I'm the kind of person that would have said, I'd like to know more about this. I'd like to hear the full story, even though I kind of know that's wrong. It's, there's got to be some good explanation. And I think there's some personalities that will listen to this and say, kind of like what I did at the end, I just never heard that before. And that does change things. It really, for example, just even the whole 153, like even just little anecdotes, like, do you know about when Jesus tells them to put their nets down and they pull exactly 153 fish out? Do you know where that's from? Have you heard of Pythagoras? Do you know this story? And for someone to say, tell me more, and you tell them the story, and they go and do the research, and they're like, it doesn't lead me to deconvert yet, but that is kind of weird. That kind of doesn't sound right. And just, you have enough of those where someone says, that doesn't sound right. You say that to yourself a couple thousand times, and eventually you do what I do. You literally say to yourself,
sparking curiosity. That's the key.
Yeah.
If you can make someone curious, then they can do the digging for themselves. And it's really important to discover it for yourself and not have it told to you.
Yes.
Yeah, so definitely sort of lighting the fuse and then stepping back. It's an interesting way of doing
that's
things.
a good point for how I create these videos, is like I don't have to have all my ducks in a row because other people need to dig their own way. So like just put some subjects out there and, spark some interest, and people do their own research. They'll figure out the best path for them to do their research, and just trying to figure out in their own head what is all this? Is this just bunk? Is it real? And I do feel like not to harp on this, but I feel like there needs to be a shift in terms of like the discussion needs to be more overwhelming in general on these subjects, in the sense of people talk, at least in the United States, they talk about Jesus all the time. It's Jesus this, everything is Jesus. And everything is Bible, everything is God. And I feel like I want to I don't want to ever be the kind of person that says, oh, Tim's putting this on blast. I want it to be calm, I want it to be friendly, I want it to be very, very neighborly. But I want to do something to get the conversation out there where people say, this is real. Like you can't neglect the mystery religions, where you can't just say, the mystery religions, I don't care about them, I just want to love Jesus. To get to a point where people say, if we talk about Jesus, by default, we're talking about mystery religions. To have those kind of conversations go back and forth.
Was it Justin Martyr who said that he thought mystery religions were invented by a time-traveling Satan?
Yeah. I forget who's... I know I read something about several of the church fathers where they would admit, they're like, yes, we do look just like the pagan religions, but it's because Satan went back in time.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had this little TARDIS or something, and it's like, yeah, and God couldn't have
that is
preempted
probably
that
my favorite apologetic of all time. That is, Satan went back in time to make it look like people who were like Jesus before Jesus appeared. Just brilliant.
I love it, though, that those quotes, that we know that the church fathers were saying this stuff, because it's like you kind of anticipate, as you do, what are the objections we're going to get, and you anticipate people are going to say, is this some kind of weird new, just, someone came up with something new. It's like, no, this was at the very beginning.
It's in the Bible.
Yeah, it's
in
the
2
Bible.
Peter.
Yeah, exactly.
Cleverly devised myths or sacred allegories.
Yeah, like they're getting this accusation from day one. You guys just copied the other religions, and you did. And they say, yeah, we do look like them, but it's because of Satan. He did it. And I love that fact, because you're like, when did mythicism really start? It did not start in the 1800s or 1900s. It started right at the beginning. And it's nice that it's so easy to show that, so people can be like, okay, yeah, if I'm going to deal with history, especially church history, I need to deal with this issue. It's
not that easy to show it. The evidence is so corrupt and fragmented, and there's so much censorship. Like, everything in biblical studies has to be caveated from the beginning. We don't know that these are the original words. It's been chopped and changed and edited so much that, like in any other field of study, that would be massive alarm bells, red flags all over the place, just going, whoa, what's going on here? But they just take it in their stride in biblical studies and go, well, we must just assume this is all correct.
Yeah, it's a consensus. Yeah, that is crazy. Well, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your expertise. I'd love to do it again as time allows. And I just thank you for being someone that puts out so much good information. And I know you mentioned before we started chatting about the Facebook group that you run. What is that focused on again?
Mythical Jesus versus historical Jesus. It's pretty much just to discuss mythicism.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have just breaking down like claims of the scholars and different people's perspectives. And I try and keep the divine Jesus out of it and just focus on the historical aspects. So faith is not allowed as an argument. We're just looking at digging down to the truth, so we can't really use faith for it, because everyone will just believe what they want to believe and disagree. So
yeah, exactly.
We'll try and keep it polite. The members of the group are really good. We tend to get very few trolls.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's just a really pleasant way to discuss history.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for what you do, and I'm looking forward to. I'll have some hopefully some. We'll get into maybe some very specific questions next time. I'd love to talk about Pythagoras a little bit more with you. That's been kind of my new thing, and I'd honestly
I'm no expert on Pythagoras.
Yeah, and I need to brush up. I would love to ask you for your take next time on astrotheology. That is kind of blowing my mind.
Books.
Yeah, just the whole, crucified between two thieves, and the whole.
I reckon Dr. Bob is the man for that stuff.
Yes, and I love listening to him, but I'd love to just hear your take on it, even if we don't go too deep. I'd love to hear what you think about it and what you've learned about it so far. And
I could take a stab at it. I'm no expert, so
yeah, and definitely appreciate your sharing your story. I know it's sometimes hard to go through all that, but I hope it inspires people. I mean, I really hope that people, as they listen to stories like yours and others that I, other people I talk to, I hope people say it's, even if they're not even close to deconverting, just think it's okay to ask hard questions. It's okay to say, this doesn't make sense. I'm not comfortable with whatever. I'm not comfortable saying genocide is part of my God's past. I'm not comfortable with all these discrepancies. Just stay a Christian if you want to. That's your call. But just to say, this doesn't sound right. For someone to just have the freedom to say that. And I think stories like yours, hopefully mine as I get it, out there, it gives people that freedom to admit it and to say there's more than the party line. And I'm hopeful it makes a difference for people, just letting people have the venue to think through these issues carefully, and hopefully it makes a difference for some people.
I appreciate the chance to talk about it, because I don't get that much around here, because most of my friends are atheists, so they're like, why would I talk about religion?
Yeah.
So it's good to have people like you online.
It's interesting. I'll have to do a little more digging and research onto that, but I'd be curious to see some of the dynamics of living in a more atheistic society and some of the effects that maybe I'm not aware of, both
Check out
positive and
Holland.
negative.
Holland is brilliant for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't honestly given too much thought to the more atheistic societies. Obviously, from an apologetics perspective, they usually bring up the bad guys. Oh, look, North Korea, or I guess they're really more religious. But
Europe is more of a post-Christian area. Well, there's still like some really Christian nations, like Poland, for example. But there's quite a lot of post-Christian nations.
Yeah, and as far as I know, again, I admit my ignorance in this, but I think some of those countries are just awesome countries where they take good care of each other. They're not descending into anarchy like you'd expect, from an apologetics perspective of, hey, once you have introduced atheism, everything falls apart. It's like, or, you as atheists are standing on the shoulders of, Christians have laid the foundation for civilization. You're kind of standing on our shoulders to even exist and talk.
Tom Holland's revisionist history, yeah.
Yeah. And it's just...
He's just a Christian apologist in disguise.
Yeah.
But yeah, they tend to be like top of the world's happiness index. Generally, the more happy a country is, the less religious it is. There's a definite correlation there.
That's interesting. Yeah, I need to get educated on that.
And North Korea is not an example of an atheist country, really. It's the most religious country on earth.
Yeah, true. Very true. Yeah,
I think Hitchens said they were only one short of a trinity, which, I don't know, is Kim Jong-un still alive?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I guess they're heading that way. Well, yeah, I've definitely got some interesting topics here I need to dive into more, and I look forward to our next conversation. I definitely want to keep the conversation
pick
going.
some specific topics into it.
So, well, thank you so much for your time. It's been awesome, and I look forward to the next time.
You make a great host. Thanks.
Thank you.